Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Shaw. Welcome to our 10th day, 10th broadcast during this Lent of a Catechism of the Orthodox Faith according to the Old Testament. We're a quarter of the way through these 40 days, these 6 weeks, and I hope you're having a blessed Lent. Yesterday, I apologize because due to a technical problem, my computer froze. I wasn't able to complete the broadcast, so we were about almost 16 minutes in, and I'd gone through the whole board, so I decided not to do it again. But we'll pick up where we left off and summarize things from yesterday and bring in some new things. So yesterday we started with this quote from Father John Romanides, who constantly made the point that patristic theology was built on this idea, that the doctrinal and dogmatic expressions of the Orthodox Church are built on the idea contained in this sentence. He who by the Spirit sees Christ in glory sees the Father. Now, in the Old Testament, of course, these terms could be different. And so it's the functionality, the function of the a human being coming into relationship with God that is detailed here. So he who by the Spirit sees the theophany in glory sees God would be the more Old Testament way of explaining it. And the theophany being a placeholder for a variety of visions and encounters that are detailed in the Old Testament, which from one point of view could be considered a series of reports of theophanies throughout the history of Israel. Now, yesterday we read about one of these theophanies in Exodus 33, 12 to 23, which I summarized here, going off of what Father John said with he who stands on the rock. Remember, in this passage, what's happening is Moses is asking God to show him his glory. And God says he will, and he puts him in the cleft of a rock, and he covers him with his hand. God covers Moses with his hand as he passed by, so Moses cannot see his face. And after he passes by, he removes his hand so Moses can see his back. So he who stands on the rock sees the glory of the Lord, but only his back and not his face. Now, I put up on the Facebook page connected to this series a quote from St. Gregory the Theologian as his second theological discourse where he discusses this passage. And he's discussing what does it mean to see his back. And he calls it the grandeur and magnificence of the creation. So this isn't the same as simply looking around and seeing things, but it's something more. It's something that happens when we see things. And we'll get in, that's what we want to detail here in our discussion of kavod theology. Now, kavod is the same as the Hebrew word that is translated in the Septuagint as the word doxa, and in English with the word glory. And in each language, this word has slightly different meaning and a slightly different implications. So we really need to get back to what the Hebrew word kavod means. And the glory we mentioned earlier is another word for the unity of God. In the Creed, there's no mention of the glory of God, but there is a mention twice of the unity of God, that we believe in one God the Father, we believe in one Lord Jesus Christ. And the one there is not a one that's added, but the singularity of God, God's singularity, God's oneness is another way of looking at the idea of God's glory. So today I want to talk a little bit about the Egyptian background for the Kavod theology, which we find particularly in the P strand of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, of the 5 books of Moses. And as we mentioned, it's made up of 4 strands: the Yahweh strand, the J strand, and the P strand, which I presented as being the oldest, although many modern scholars consider the P strand the newest, because some elements seem to extend into post-exilic. By that we mean after the Babylonian exile and the return of the Israelites to Jerusalem, that they find elements that are that late, and thus they conclude it was written that late. But I believe that this theology of the P strain, which is the liturgical theology of the Jerusalem temple, can be shown to go back well into Egyptian theology, in particular to Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti. Now, I mentioned that Abraham came from the land of Mitanni, which is at the point in the where the 2 great international trading roads meet. The East-West Silk Road, although it wasn't a Silk Road in those days, but the great East-West Road, and the North-South Road coming from the tip of the Arabian Peninsula, bringing frankincense up into Mitanni. And this road met, as we mentioned the other day, the road coming up from Egypt, going through the pass of Megiddo, Armageddon Pass, into the Jezreel Valley, and then meeting up with the incense road east of the Jordan. So all of these roads come together, and all roads meet in Haran, the land of Abraham, and the land where Abraham's descendants went back to get their wives. So there's constant communication in the patriarchal period back to Mitanni. And the Mitannians were a great civilization of the time, often forgotten about. And the Mitannians intermarried with Pharaoh. And so we have Nefertiti bringing her theological ideas into Egypt and marrying the Pharaoh Akhenaten, who, for some reason, historians argue about why, had a complete revolution in the worship of Egypt. So we know there was a very well-developed system of temples, priests, elaborate systems of gods, holy days, pilgrimages. All of these aspects of religion were in full swing. And Akhenaten stopped it all. He disbanded the entire religious structure of Egypt and even built a new city, the city of Amarna, and dedicated to a new concept of God, which he called the Aten. This did not go over well ultimately, and not long after the time of Akhenaten and the time of King Tut, who's well known, his offspring, that Egypt returned to its old worship, its old ways. Amarna was abandoned, and thus we were able to find the remains of the religion of the Aten, of Akhenaten, intact under the desert sands, together with many letters and other documents that have made it possible for us to reconstruct a lot about this idea of the Aten. So what was the idea of the Aten? The Aten was the sun disk, was the actual visible sun. Now, this is important because in Egyptian mythology, the sun is a god, and the god Ra, and has other symbols, other characteristics, and so forth. All this was done away with. Instead, more what we might call demythologized and naturalistic, and even, according to some scholars, scientific. This was a move towards a more scientific view of the world. That Akhenaten proclaimed there was only one God, and that God was the Aten, the sun disk, the visible sun in the sky. But within this theology, there was it wasn't simply a naturalistic modern theology, as we would, or non-theology, an atheist theology, where there was no God in any sense. There was. And what the Aten had three components to it. The Aten had the sun itself. And we might think, well, what's the difference between the sun itself and the sun disk? There is a difference. The sun itself is a great orb full of, it has gravity, has size, weight, dimension. And the sun disk is what we can see. And the sun disk, in its brightness, in the Aten theology, prevents us from seeing the sun itself, which is dark and hidden behind the sun disk. So there's the dark sun behind the sun disk, which is the Aten, and then the Aten sends out the sun rays, and the sun rays then come down to Akhenaten and his wife and his children. You'll see, if you look online, look up Aten and look in any image aggregators, such as in any web browser, and you'll find, looking on Google or Yahoo or anywhere, you'll see images from this time. And what you'll see is a picture of the sun and the sun rays. Of course, the invisible sun itself cannot be portrayed. And there's descending down into Akhenaten and Nefertiti's upraised hands. So we have a holy family receiving the blessings from the sun rays, and in a depiction of the Aten, the sun disk in the sky. Now, the idea here is that the sun is the creator, because the visible world that we see and participate in, we can only see because of light. And light, in a sense, creates, let's say, in our virtual reality, inside our own minds, our own contact reality, we can only come into contact with that reality in a visual way because there's light. So the sun rays make the sun disk visible, and also everything else visible. So reality is created because of the Aten. But the Aten is hiding behind itself the sun itself. So there's these three levels. And we find the same idea then in Kavod theology. In Kavod theology, where God is located on his throne in the heavens, which is then there's a participation or a unification of that throne with the Holy of Holies and the area between the cherubim on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. These things we'll discuss more in detail as we go along. And on the Day of Atonement, when the priest goes into the Holy of Holies, he brings a shovel full of incense, and that incense sends up a big cloud. And that cloud, the Nophos, G-N-O-P-H-O-S, we'll discuss later, is the darkness of God. And in the Holy of Holies also is the seven lamp menorah, the seven lamp candle stand, which is on the side sending light across this cloud. And so you have the cloud of incense with the light going through it, and you have a representation of the darkness and of the sun rays. But of course, the theophany itself is something to be experienced by the priest while he's there on the Day of Atonement. So we have the same concepts as Father in later Christian theology as Father, the unknown, unseeable, inaccessible Father, and the Son, the theophany, the God is revealed. And then the means by which the revealed theophany can be seen, which is the rays of the sun. So the Kavod theology appears in my mind to be a continuation of Egyptian ideas, going back clearly to Akhenaten. But these ideas of Akhenaten were undoubtedly influenced by Mitannian ideas about the nature of God, about the unity of God, that there wasn't a multiplicity of many, many gods, but there was one God, the creator, who could be seen in the sky. What was seen in the sky was a theophany, and the means of being able to see God in the sky are the sun rays. Now, this in Orthodox theology, then, of the fathers, the glory, which is all of this, right, has, and this is the unity of God then in our theology. The glory has two parts, the essence, the unknowable part, and the energy, which is the knowable part. This is mirrored in the Aten theology by the sun itself, which is unknowable, and the sun disk and rays, which are knowable. Another term for the glory that we encounter a lot in Orthodox theology is the uncreated light of the Mount of Transfiguration. Now we know Jesus goes up into the Mount of Transfiguration, and there he encounters Elijah and Moses, who also had theophanies on mountaintops. And Peter, James, and John are down below, and they see a light. Now, it became a very, very contested issue in late Byzantium, and this is particularly connected with St. Gregory Palamas, who we will celebrate soon in Lent. And the contention was this light a natural light? In other words, was Jesus shining like a light bulb with photons emitting out of him that was seen by the apostles Peter, James, and John, or was something else going on? Now, there were those who believed that it was a created light, that they were photons. There was a tradition going back to St. Augustine that had maintained this idea that the theophanies, Augustine maintained, were creations. That it wasn't an actual appearance of God, but God created something to teach people. And so these things went in and out of existence and were composed of created objects. Now, St. Gregory Palamas strongly opposed this idea as it was being taught still among certain people within the Orthodox Church, because this struggle wasn't, as some people portray it, between against scholastic theology and ideas that were going on farther in the West, but this was an internal discussion within the Orthodox Church on the nature of God's glory. Is God's glory, when it's seen as light, a created light or an uncreated light? In the position of St. Gregory Palamas, and thus the understanding of the Orthodox Church, is this is an uncreated light of transfiguration, which is the energy of God. So when we talk about the grandeur of creation, we're not talking about just looking around seeing how beautiful things are. Well, we're talking about a specific experience that the saints have had and that is reported in various ways in the Bible, which is an experience of seeing or sensing, one could almost say, the God behind the creation, the God like the sun itself behind the sun disk, revealed to us by the sun rays, that this same idea holds that God himself is just behind everything, just behind the creation. He's creating right now. He's creating everything in the physical world at this moment as we speak. And that is hidden by the visible things around us. God is hidden, but just there. Just like the sun disk is just right there in front of the sun, it appears to in our eyes to be up in the sky, and yet right behind it, so to speak, or the same thing as the sun disk, but invisible, is the body of the sun itself, and its weight and its gravity. Because light is very light, it doesn't have any weight, and yet the sun itself is a very weighty thing. And of course, the word kavod, as we mentioned, comes from the idea of weight, of having gravity. So this is the sun as having full gravity, and this is the sun as not having gravity, but simply being an image of the sun. So the same way one can see, if one is in the right, through the Spirit, one can see the glory of the creation. And this is the experience that's reported in the lives of many saints. And there's a story from the time of the Russian elders of a journalist. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, Saint Seraphim of Sarah, that a journalist comes to him, and the saint puts his arm on the journalist's shoulder and says, "You've been seeking something all your life. Well, here it is." And suddenly the journalist sees all of creation light up around him. So what is he seeing? He's seeing the uncreated light of transfiguration, which goes back to these ideas, Egyptian ideas. So I wanted to close off today by reading once again from Exodus, the same passage we read yesterday, but now with better understanding of what's going on here. According to St. Gregory's interpretation, then the rock is Jesus Christ, the resurrected Lord. If we stand on the rock, then we can see the glory of God, but not his face, not the hidden part, only his back, the visible part. Then God said, "I will pass before you in my glory, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, before you. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for no man can see my face and live." Moreover, the Lord said, "Here is a place by me. You shall stand on the rock. So it shall be, while my glory passes by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and will cover you with my hand while I pass by. Then I will take away my hand, and you will see my back, but my face shall not be seen." What's interesting here is that there are three parts to God's glory in this description. We mentioned the back and the face, but there's also the hand of God, the hand that creates, the hand that upholds. And it's the hand of God that protects Moses from what would kill him if he saw it, and draws away to reveal what he can see. So we can see a Trinitarian possible symbolism in the glory here of that which it cannot be seen, his face being the Father, what he does see, his back being Christ, and the means by which he can see or not see, which is the hand, which would be the Spirit. So that's it for today, a brief overview of Kavod theology. We're going to be looking at this in a liturgical context as we get into discussing next the temple, the Jerusalem temple, and about its theology, its rites, and its symbols as we proceed on, and how these relate then to the New Testament and ultimately to Christ himself. But to mention one further thing. The rock, which is the word Petra, and is the name that Peter receives. And he receives this because after the transfiguration, Christ asks, "Who am I?" He says, "Well, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ." And he says, "On this rock I will build my church." Now, this has been interpreted, of course, in many ways, but we can see that what Jesus is referring back to is Exodus 33. That it's on this rock, that it's on this experience of he who by the Spirit sees Christ in glory, sees the Father, that the church is built. This is the center of the belief system of the church, of its practice, of its doctrinal doctrinal expressions, of its dogmatic canons. Everything about the church comes back to this rock, the rock Moses stood on where he saw the glory of God. So that's it for today. We'll see you again tomorrow. Hope you continue to have a blessed Lent. Thank you.